My topic this morning is the origin of language. And this is a talk that I've given, maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago, and I was looking for the opportunity to speak at the New Mexico Bible School, and I went back through my talks, and that's why I'm looking at this one. I decided to use it this morning. Okay, and this is with the origin of language. I want to direct attention to this well-known painting on the screen by Peter Bruegel in A.D. 1563, titled "The Tower of Babel," utilized here as an introduction to this morning's presentation, "The Origin of Language." There are two separate depictions of this subject by the Flemish artist. This one hanging in a museum in Vienna. Peter Bruegel, in his era, was recognized as the most significant artist, painter, and was constantly in demand. Now, I chose this image as it purposely reflects the account of God confounding the one speech of the growing population following the flood, scattering them just as both Adam and Noah had been charged to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Genesis 1:28. Thus, by confounding their ability to communicate with one another, we are told that the Lord scattered them abroad upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the tower. Though impressed by this painting, I had never really analyzed it. It's not just a picture of an unfinished or perhaps a dilapidating structure. It appears that the artist was projecting a biblical story of human pride and divine punishment. We read that the people wanted a tower whose top would reach unto heaven, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth, in contradiction to God's command to replenish the earth. Now, we notice the activity below. In the left corner of the painting here enlarged, where we see what has been assumed to be Nimrod, the grandson of Ham. Ham, of course, was a son of Noah, surrounded by a crowd of workmen, assistants, onlookers, some of which are bowing before him. Note the activity around Nimrod reflected in this painting, presented in great detail by the artist. Josephus addresses the role of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 4, titled "Concerning the Tower of Babylon and the Confusion of Tongues." Josephus wrote that it was Nimrod who excited the people to such an affront and contempt of God. Josephus describes Nimrod as a very bold man, persuading the people not to ascribe the project to God as if it was through his means that they were made happy, but rather to believe that it was through their own courage which procured their happiness. Josephus describes the people to have followed Nimrod, esteeming it cowardice to submit to God. And the tower grew very high sooner than expected, built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar made of bitumen. Bitumen is a petroleum product used to waterproof. Now, let me click. Bruegel may have been inspired by the Colosseum when he was in Rome, reminiscent of Roman architecture, which at that time the Colosseum was already partially fallen, as Bruegel's depiction depicts. We are told that Bruegel traveled throughout Europe making sketches to be referred to later. But now getting back to the tower, all in all, the structure appears unstable as well as crumbling in places. It appears the bottom layers have apparently either been disturbed or not completed, while the higher layers appear to be in process. Thus, Peter Bruegel's image of what he depicted in his mind's eye was fashioned as a ziggurat, a step tower, reflecting his view of the people's pride and God's divine intervention. It is also interesting that the word Babylon is reflective of the word Babel, meaning wordy or confusing language. Also, Genesis 9:28 and 9 tells us that Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were a total of 950 years, and he died. Jewish tradition states that Noah was 940 when the Tower of Babel was abandoned. By that reckoning, there were 339 years between when Noah and his family left the ark and when the post-flood population left off building the tower. So moving on to the origin of language. You know, we speak, we think, we conceptualize within a language system. The World Atlas reports that there are 7,151 recognized languages in use today, whereas it is estimated that there are between 6,500 and 8,300 languages in all the earth. However, not all of these languages are widely spoken or documented. Some languages have only a few speakers left, while others are used by millions of people. The most extensive catalog of the languages of the world is Ethnologue, the world's most comprehensive catalog of languages, listing the known languages and providing information and statistics for all the world's living as well as known languages. Since 1951, Ethnologue has been an active research project involving hundreds of linguists and researchers. Also, it is important to understand that dialects are not classified as languages. A dialect is defined as a regional variety of language distinguished by features of vocabulary, grammar, and punctuation. Now, all people have language, yet linguists confess that they do not know how languages originated. Dr. Mario Pye, noted linguist and author, states, if there is one thing on which all linguists are fully agreed, it is that the problem of the origin of human speech is still unsolved. Well, linguists have speculated upon several evolutionary-based theories which cling to the supposition that man was once speechless. Of course, you know, they think that people were cavemen and had to learn how to talk. Well, language as well as culture is presented as having developed gradually as mankind discovered and advanced in both language and in social skills. Assuming linguists actually believe that mankind evolved and was speechless, in contrast to the Genesis account of the creation of Adam and Eve, wherein Adam gave names to every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Genesis 2:19. Still, linguists theorize that language must have developed in stages, purporting simplistic explanations as to how man first began to utter speech. Typical theories speculate that language began as a result of ancestral vocalizations, setting the stage for language through physical adaptations and cognitive leaps spanning millions of years, of course. Yes. One long-standing theory proposed that a shift in throat structure enabled more modern humans to speak. Specifically, the larynx, voice box, in Homo sapiens is positioned much lower relative to cervical vertebrae compared to so styled primitive ancestors, allowing subtle evolutionary changes and tweaks that reshaped mankind's faces and larynxes, setting the stage for complex speech. Really. Several other simplistic theories suggested include primitive man's ability to form contrasting vowel sounds, as is observed in monkeys and baboons, critical for communication. Theorists suggest that this may have set the stage for complex speech, thought, and ideas. Then there's natural human sounds, which are actually reflexes or reactions to such stimuli as pain, hunger, pleasure, etc. These sounds, laughter, screams, and shouts, would have been recognized as meaningful and were developed over time into conceptual messages. Again, I say, really? Man's attempt to imitate animal sounds, for instance, by imitating the wolf howl, man found that he could communicate the concept of wolf to others. Man's use of recognizable sounds to name recognizable objects, actions, and phenomena, such as shouting boom to express thunder. This theory implies a correlation between sound and meaning. So in summary, the evolutionary linguist's position is that language developed from physical adaptations and ancestral vocalizations, leading up to sophisticated language through cognitive leaps spanning what they say is millions of years. Of course. Therefore, the evolutionary theories vary, but the concept is the same. They all embrace an evolutionary process in which man, having the physical ability to produce and manipulate sounds, learns to do so in an effort to enhance the quality of group interaction. This gradual process of developing communication is commonly proposed to have allowed cultures to appear and advance. Cooperation, organization, and education require language skills. Those groups best equipped for language are proposed as advancing culturally, while groups without the necessary language skills, of course, are going to remain primitive. Now, on the surface, this line of reasoning may appear to have merit to the uninformed. The mind conditioned to evolutionary precepts might eagerly embrace such theories as plausible. Also, noting the conceptual simplicity of ancient written records, such as hieroglyphics and the known development of dialects within existing language families. It is easy to confuse language development with language origins. However, these theories can be tested. If language came into existence through an evolutionary process, would we not expect to find relatively simple languages among so-called primitive peoples? Likewise, would there not be evidence of more complex languages in advanced societies where developing societal institutions both demanded and created more complex language skills? Well, we find that a review of the so-called primitive languages does not support this speculation. The primitive label itself might lead us to look for simple language concepts and simple composition. In the most isolated and primitive people around the globe, might we expect little more than monosyllabic words accompanied by occasional body sounds, grunts, nods, laughs, and gestures? Such is the conditioning of the imagination of our evolution-oriented educational system. The following excerpts from Dr. Pye's The Story of Language lay these assumptions to rest. The language of primitive groups does not cast too much light upon the problem. They are, as a rule, anything but primitive, save with reference to the vocabulary of modern civilization. Linguists who explore these tongues regularly find in them refinements of distinctions and complexities unknown to our languages. And primitive tongues have an amazing complexity of objects, concepts, and terms for which we, from our supposed vantage point, have no equivalent. Note, Swahili has 8 noun classes, and Swahili is the simplest of the Bantu languages, some of which have up to 26 noun classes. By comparison, Romance languages have 3, masculine, feminine, and neuter. English has only 1. In a language of Guatemala, every verb can have thousands of different forms by the addition of various endings. Javanese has 10 words for to stand and 20 for to sit, according to posture, attitude, and symbolism. Eskimo has nearly a dozen words for snow, indicating that it is soft, loose, hard, packed, frozen, crusted, melting. One Pacific Northwest Indian language distinguishes between the recent past, the remote past, and the mythological past, while the native Australian Aborigine language has 5 future tenses, 3 past tenses, instant, proximal, and remote, and 2 for things that will happen today and for other more indefinite future periods. The Encyclopedia Britannica bears witness to Dr. Pye's observations. It is, moreover, a total fallacy to suppose that the languages of illiterate or so-called primitive peoples are less structured, less rich in vocabulary, and less efficient than the languages of literate civilizations. Observation bears out the statement of the U.S. anthropological linguist Edward Sapir made in 1921, saying, when it comes to linguistic form, Plato walks with the Macedonian swineherd, Confucius with the head-hunting savage of Assam. Well, the above illustrates that there are no primitive languages, and the evidence certainly does not lend itself to evolutionary theory. To the contrary, what we observe today is a process of reduction and simplification in both numbers of languages and complexity from previously highly structured languages. The majority of the world's population now speaks one of 14 languages, Chinese being first and English being second. And within all languages, there is ongoing change toward simplification. For instance, we experience some difficulty with the English of Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616 AD. Far more with the English of Chaucer, 1340 to 1400 AD. And we must consider the English of King Alfred, 849 to 899 AD, a foreign tongue. The language of present civilizations appears to have been more complex and involved as we trace them back into history, and conversely, simplified as we approach their present form. They were once quite complex, but some of them, like Chinese and English, went through an historically attested process of simplification and reduction to a more analytic monosyllabic structure. Thus, observable changes in the direction of simplification from a highly ordered state, the opposite of the linguist's evolutionary assumptions. What central or social necessity within so styled primitive societies might have sustained such complexity of speech? And how is it that so-called advanced cultures communicate and thrive with so much less? Keep in mind, language is speech. One of the pitfalls in understanding language is in equating language with literacy, the ability to read and write. When observing ancient writings such as cuneiform and hieroglyphics, one must keep in mind the primacy of speech and language. In societies where literacy is commonplace, one is apt to think of language as a system of writing which may be spoken. To the contrary, As the Encyclopedia Britannica states, language is a system of spoken communication that may be represented in various ways of writing. The written word only represents the spoken language. And whereas some written systems may perform well, others may not. Scientific studies of the origin of language can begin only as far back as written records exist. Thus, there is clearly a sizable gulf between real and supposed origins, a gulf not open to scientific scrutiny. Well, in many countries today, literacy is still the privilege of the minority, and not all languages are written. Both Eskimo and Zulu are reported to have vocabularies of 20,000 plus words. Now, that's thousands of words in excess of the vocabulary of the average U.S. college student. And until recently, those languages were unwritten. Some African and South American Indian languages remain unwritten. Even in literate societies, we learn to speak before we learn to write. And we act as speakers and listeners more than writers and readers. Let me read that again. Even in literate societies, we learn to speak before we learn to write, and we act as speakers and listeners more than writers and readers. Cultural and economic needs obviously play a part in the development of the written systems, but there is no evidence that they played a similar role in speech development. Let's move on to a more plausible origin of language. Yes. Yeah, in Genesis 2:19-20, we read, "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowls of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him." Now, these verses clearly indicate that Adam had been given language and a vocabulary with which he could communicate with his Creator, a language with which he could reason and relate with understanding sufficient to assign names to all the animals brought to him. In verses 21-23, we're told, "God made a woman from one of Adam's ribs. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Adam had a mind that was much, much stronger than any of our minds, you know. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, in Genesis 11, 1-9, is found the story of Babel. Now, this account relates that the descendants of Noah were of one language. They were in the process of building a city and a tower when through divine intervention, their speech was suddenly divided. Their inability to communicate led to their dispersal throughout the earth. Two important elements of this account attract our attention. Number one, the sudden division of speech. And number two, the scattering abroad upon the face of the earth. As Genesis 11:7 relates, "Let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." Implied is the sudden appearance of different and fully developed languages. They could still speak, but they couldn't understand one another group's speech. Rather than one common unifying language that they previously possessed, we surmise that suddenly there existed several different groups of people speaking languages unknown to the other groups. No longer able to communicate, their cooperation ceased. Existing evidence supports the understanding that these diverse original languages were completely developed and organized. You know, God can do anything, and he does do anything. Languages fall into families. Within these families, resemblances can be traced back to a common source, but there is no relation between language families. Thus, the biblical account goes hand in hand with the linguist's conclusion that major language groups are independent from each other in the earth. The scattering of the Babel population likewise deserves our attention. When God blessed Noah, his instruction were, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, Genesis 9:1. Yet, in the Babel account, the people wanted a city and a tower to quote, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. In other words, they were going to do just exactly what God told them not to do, you know. Genesis 11:4. Using division of speech, God achieved the replenishing of the earth, and as a result, we find different language families in different parts of the earth. The European community is of one family, the Asian another, the African another, etc., etc. Although major continents contain more than one language family, the boundaries between these family territories remain relatively distinct even to our present age. Henry Haley, in his Bible handbook, Archaeological Discoveries, offers a bit of evidence which supports the common ancestry of the varied peoples and language families existing today. He says, Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, Persians, Indus, Greek, Chinese, Islanders, Esquimaux, Aboriginal Americans, Indians, Brazilians, Peruvians, indeed, every branch of the whole human race, Semitic, Aryan, and Tartarian, have traditions of a great deluge that destroyed all mankind except one family, which impressed itself indelibly on the memory of the ancestors of all these diverse peoples and races before they separated. Mr. Haley reviews the flood traditions of 10 cultures, all variations of the Genesis account. One might question how different cultures with different languages in different parts of the world might share a common tradition. Although not lending themselves to evolutionary explanation, these traditions certainly complement and support both the sequence and the events related in Genesis. The common worldwide tradition of the flood is intelligible only on the supposition that such an event actually occurred and being handed down from generations to generations by a diverse and a common ancestry. So all of those peoples have this common tradition within them. Now, if we were to believe the evolutionary teaching currently taking place in schools and colleges, that speech merely evolved over the ages as a natural process over time, yet no one is quite sure how and why there are no known animals that are in transitional phase from non-speaking to speaking. You know, if basic man, learned to do it, well, shouldn't the animals also have learned to talk? In fact, in the Atlas of Languages, we note this remarkable admission. No languageless community of people or animals has ever been found. Does not this represent a problem for the linguist theory of evolution? Considering the results of language research, it is difficult to understand why linguists and educators cling to evolutionary theories of language origin. These theories are not subject to verification by the scientific method, a fact recognized as far back as 1866, when the Linguistic Society of Paris, perhaps the foremost academic linguistic institution at the time, instituted a ban on papers on the origin of language. And yet, the biblical account, the source which they reject, goes hand in hand with observable evidence. Though the wise of this world declare the origins of language to be unsolvable, the servants of the Most High should not be found speechless on this subject. Moving on now to what might be considered speculative considerations. One might ask, why did God let Adam name the animals? And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to all fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. Let me go on, going down. These verses, you can't quite see that. These verses tell us that is a fully developed language and vocabulary. God gave Adam intelligence sufficient that he might be verbal and logical, understanding the meaning and use of words, and the ability to conceptually and abstractly discern and apply concepts and patterns. In answer to the question, why did God let Adam name the animals? Well, we might assume that God, having given Adam language, knowledge, and understanding, assigned that task to him, in that he was destined to have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. What a task and a job was given to Adam. Wow. Let me see where I left off here. Genesis 1, 3, 4. Verses 1. Okay, let's see. Here it is. Okay. Now, after God gave Adam, as well as his descendants, dominion over all these things, Adam and all mankind would be able to discern and respond appropriately in regard to animals of all kinds. So Junior would come home and say, "Oh, guess what I saw today?" And he could name it. A follow-up question. A follow-up question. What does the phrase in Genesis 2:19 imply? And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. It appears to indicate that God accepted Adam's naming of the animals, in that nothing further in that matter has been addressed in the scriptures, and in that God affirmed the various creatures assigned names throughout his references to animals in both we find in the Old and the New Testament. That just a thought. Not only did Adam name the various animals that God brought to him, he apparently was given the ability to remember their names and associations, as well as to teach them to his family and his descendants. Again, miracle things that we just can't understand during this very, very early stage of mankind. This subject, let's see. Yeah. This subject of Adam naming the animals speaks to mankind's God-given language and vocabularies, as well as to our God-given intelligence to conceptually discern and apply ourselves. So the ability that he gave Adam, I guess I'd be too boastful to say, but I don't think that that I think being able to understand the concept and words, that as time went on, I think people just don't have what he had. The subject of Adam, naming the animals. Let's see, did I say that? Is God's given language and vocabularies, as well as our God-given intelligence to conceptually discern and apply ourselves, that we might understand God's word and his plan and purpose to take out a people for his name. Yeah, it's just kind of hard to kind of speculate exactly the process that started with Adam and came up and now is with us. Okay, moving on now to the naming of Adam and Eve. Well, we now know how the varied animals got their names and identities. But how did Adam and Eve receive their names? Let's first consider Eve. Eve is referenced only 4 times in the Bible: Genesis 3:20, 4:1, 2 Corinthians 11:3, and 1 Timothy 2:13. Her creation takes place following God's assertion that it is not good for a man to be alone, Genesis 2:18. We're told that God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and while he slept, he took one of Adam's ribs and made a woman. The word woman is Strong's number 802, Issa, I-S-S-A, interpreted life. And God brought her to Adam. Now notice, Genesis 2:23 reads, and Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called a woman. Again, Strong's number 802, because he was taken out of man. Now note how Adam, with his God-given language, understanding and associations, he gave Eve a name. He named her. Eve's name is perhaps a verb as much as it is a noun, in that the word also translates as life. Thus, Adam named her woman. Also interpreted Issa, I-S-S-A, Strong's number 2425, meaning life, to live, and living. All three come from that word. Thus, the first woman and wife was to become the mother of all living. Moses' account of the first couple is sparse here, but Eve's role and achievements were surely significant, though not recorded in the scriptures. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him, male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. Now let's look a little closer at this. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him, male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their names Adam in the day when they were created. Notice that the Hebrew word man in verse 1 reinforces man, human beings, humankind, people, etc. That word Adam incorporates those. The Hebrew word Adama references the earth, the soil, as well as man. When in verse 2:19 God created man, he was referencing the creation of mankind. When God brought the animals to be named, he brought them to man, i.e., Adam, and that word became Adam's word also. So, in effect, God named Adam through the Hebrew word, the Hebrew word Adam referenced all mankind. Thus, we understand that Adam's name originated from the Hebrew Adama, symbolizing mankind's connection to the earth. And the best thing to do is just to consider Adam was the only man there. So his name was Adam. But the word Adam has implications too. Okay. Um, okay. And last but not least, a final language related consideration. Um, linguistic universals. Linguistic universals are patterns that occur systematically across existing languages. In other words, all languages have nouns and verbs and consonants and vowels, things like that. Um, Secularists have always considered it a mythical proposition that a divine engineer, God, could have installed a language program in Eden, nor that multinational history could have been neurologically kick-started at the Tower of Babel with spin-offs that have since devolved into our 7,000 tongues. So this linguistic universals is basically just a final language consideration. At the same time, linguist Noam Chomsky postulated that the human brain is hardwired for language, which he suggests was engineered by some super intelligent power. He didn't want to say God, I guess, but it's a super intelligent power. And but then consider how quickly young children, infants, very soon they learn language. They don't have to, you don't have to teach it. They just learn it. And recent linguists have concluded that all the Earth's languages did indeed come from one universal language, which we might guess to be none other than ancient Hebrew, being this is just a speculation that it was Hebrew. I don't know. A new science called Edenics, working with a primitive Semitic Edenic vocabulary in which each root letter carries the gene for the wide diversity of the world's words, now offers 23,000 such coincidences. Edenics doesn't use Kabbalistic, i.e., Jewish mystical symbolic formula, only the bread and butter stuff that is already used to link, say, French with Italian. What are those links? For instance, in English, giraffe, skunk, gopher, and horse are merely sounds. But in biblical Hebrew, goref means neck, soken means stinker, kofer means digger, and horesh means plower. Thus, every sound could be utilized to carry the genes for the diversity of the world's diverse languages. Thus, every sound could be utilized to carry the genes for the diversity of the diverse languages. Okay. Many foreign words will become familiar to Hebrew speakers after simple letter shifts or reversals. Others remain strikingly unchanged. For example, in Hawaii, they dance the hula. At the Red Sea, Miriam danced the mahol. The root is het lamed, conveying the idea of shaking, as in the hula. We end here with, wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, Even all my fierce anger and all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. But for then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. Thank you.